Pelican Valley is a vast, beautiful backcountry area in Wyoming's Yellowstone National Park. It looks like a postcard with its lush meadows, gentle creeks, and panoramic mountain views. This seems like the most idyllic spot to pitch a tent and sleep under the stars. Pelican Valley has a dark side. Staying overnight requires a special permit. Due to its danger, the park rangers look you in the eye and warn you before giving you one. They advise going into the valley only in groups of 4 or more. They say it's not advice, just for your safety. 25-year-old Brigitte Fredenhagen arrived at Yellowstone on July 28, 1984. She attended with her brother Andreas and sister-in-law Junko. Their adventure took them to one of America's natural wonders. The first night, they did what most visitors do. They stayed at Grant Village, a popular campground, safe, established, and full of campers. The next day, they visited the park's Norris Geyser, a stunning hot spring. The day was perfect. They visited the park ranger's office on their way back to their campsite that afternoon. Brigitte stopped here. She planned and set a trip goal. She wanted a night alone in Pelican Valley. When the three entered the office, the rangers thought they were applying for a group permit. They started the paperwork easily because 3 was close to 4, the recommended number. Just going through the motions, but Brigitte spoke up. She stated that the permit was personal. She traveled alone. The office atmosphere changed immediately. Rangers stopped what they were doing to talk her out of it. They told her it was a bad idea and that no one, especially a novice, should enter Pelican Valley alone. They described risks, wildlife, and isolation. Brigitte was confident and calm. She assured them she was experienced. Her solo camping experience gave her a full understanding of the risks. She wanted to go. She was supported by Andreas and Junko behind her. They told the rangers she was skilled and knew her stuff. The park rangers were upset. You could tell by their faces. This situation made them uneasy. Finally, Brigitte was an adult. She was determined and they couldn't legally stop her. So they agreed reluctantly. As a last precaution, they asked her to show them her camp location on a map. That way, if something went wrong or they wanted to check on her, they would know where to look. She pointed to a forested area on the map bordering a large meadow. They noted it, gave her the permit, and wished her luck. After getting the permit, the 3 left the office and returned to their campsite for one last night. Next morning, they woke up early. The car was packed and they drove to Pelican Valley Trailhead. They exited the car and hiked into the valley. They walked a few miles as planned. Then they stopped. For Andreas and Junko, this was it. Andreas told Brigitte they would turn back and meet her at the trailhead tomorrow afternoon. After saying goodbye and hugging, Andreas and Junko turned around and walked back to the car. Brigitte watched them go, then turned and continued her journey alone through Pelican Valley's vast wilderness. Andreas and Junko drove back to the trailhead at the agreed-upon time the next day. They waited, hour passed, and another. Brigitte never appeared. Their small worry grew into a heavy dread as the afternoon progressed. They knew something was wrong after 2 hours of anxious waiting and calling her name into the woods. A phone was found and park rangers were called. They said Brigitte hadn't returned from her solo camping trip. The rangers on the other end said they hadn't seen her but would immediately check. They knew where to go. The map location Brigitte indicated was in a densely wooded area next to a large meadow. Rangers couldn't scan the area remotely due to geography. To see anything, they had to walk to the campsite. The rangers crossed the meadow into the dense forest. They shouted, "Brigitte!" Park rangers! But only the wind in the trees responded. After venturing through the woods, they reached her designated spot. There it was. Her tent, however, the scene they entered was strange and felt wrong. One of the tent's nylon walls had a large vertical tier as they approached. Carefully, they peered in. Everything was in place. She neatly placed her foam sleeping mat in the middle. She had her flashlight off to the right of the mat. On the left was a small tape player with headphones. Before sleeping, she probably listened to music. Battery death was complete, but the play button was still pressed. At the mat's foot was her backpack. All her clothes were carefully packed in Ziploc bags. These were common ways experienced campers hid their scent from animals. The pack contained a wilderness survival guide with the corner folded down to a specific page. The page showed a diagram for stringing food in a tree to keep bears and other wildlife away. The rangers left the tent and searched nearby. Her sleeping bag was 2 meters away. It was perfectly flat on the ground, almost like it had been sun-dried. However, closer inspection revealed 2 puncture marks in the fabric. One was near her neck and the other near her torso. The bag had no blood, which was confusing. Rangers were leaning toward an animal attack, but the campsite's cleanliness was throwing them off. A large animal attacking a campsite usually causes chaos. It appears a bomb exploded. Tents are shredded, gear scattered. This place was disturbingly clean. One ranger saw something on the ground as they circled the campsite, calling for Brigitte. A faint drag trail in the leaves and dirt led away from the sleeping bag. It went west into the forest and up a small hill. The rangers followed. 20 meters from camp, Brigitte's cooler was found. It lay on its side. A piece of rope nearby suggested she had strung her food in a tree like the book showed. Whatever food was inside was gone. It was taken down. From the cooler, rangers followed the faint drag trail. 20 more meters up the hill, they found a woman's sweater on the ground. It was bloody and torn. They realized it was serious. The Rangers raised their rifles and moved cautiously. Another 40 meters took them over the hill and into a quiet woods clearing. Brigittida was found there. Or her remnants. The exact sequence of events that night will never be known, but investigators were able to piece together the most likely scenario from the physical evidence present. Brigittida slept in her tent after setting up camp. She listened to music in her sleeping bag with headphones. Later, a large male grizzly bear wandering the area smelled her food. Brigittida's cooler, strung in a tree 20 meters from her tent, was found. She hadn't strung it high enough. The bear stood on its hind legs and clawed the cooler down. Despite eating everything, the bear was hungry. It sniffed around for more. Grizzlies in Yellowstone, especially in Pelican Valley, can get used to humans. Their fear disappears. It appears this bear was one. When it saw Brigittida's tent, it didn't run. It likely saw the tent as a food source. Bear quietly approached tent side. It cut through the nylon wall with one huge paw. It then bit Brigittida's skull with its head inside. There were no signs of fighting inside or around the tent. She was probably asleep when the attack started. With her headphones on, she may not have heard the 600-pound predator approaching. The bear then pulled her by the head from the tent and campsite. She was dragged 80 meters over the hill to that clearing and consumed. This attack is why Pelican Valley is so dangerous. Prime grizzly bear habitat. Human attacks are rare, but most people don't realize how horrific they are. Grizzlies rarely kill prey before eating. Their size and strength trap their victim, preventing escape. Eating often occurs while the prey is alive. Some experts say they prefer it this way. In many grizzly attacks, the victim's arms and legs are eaten first to keep them alive and conscious. There was so little of Brigittida that her death time could not be determined. However, this bear's unusual behavior in targeting a human may have led to a painful death. Our next story takes us to a small Egyptian coastal town. A 24-year-old man named Yuri Lipsky stood outside a Dahab cafe on April 28, 2000, looking out over the deep blue Red Sea. He went from Moscow to the Sinai Peninsula for one reason. He wanted to film himself scuba diving through the arch. But as he stood there, it looked like his dream might not come true. Underwater tunnel, the arch is 85 feet long. The Blue Hole, a massive shoreline sinkhole, is connected to the Red Sea. Divers must enter the Blue Hole and descend straight down. At 181 feet, you reach the arch's entrance at the tunnel's top. The catch is serious. Walking down the entrance is notoriously hard to spot. If you descend too fast or don't pay attention, you can miss the arch's ceiling and go much deeper than you intended. Too much depth doesn't mean you'll miss the tunnel. The entrance is huge. From 181 to 393 feet, it drops. Going too deep is dangerous because of what happens to the body under extreme pressure and the gas you're breathing. There are two types of dives for non-divers. The first is recreational diving. The majority of vacationers do this. Normal, compressed air is what you're breathing, just packed into a scuba tank. 130 feet is recommended for regular air. Beyond that is technical diving. Technical divers breathe trimix or heliox, a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen. These mixtures let them safely descend below 130 feet. This diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires extensive training and equipment. To reach the arch, you must descend 161 feet. This is technical diving. This requires a special gas mixture and training. However, overconfident tourists try to dive the arch on regular air every year. Year after year, people try and die. Your body absorbs nitrogen from the air when under pressure. Nitrogen narcosis results from overabsorption. The feeling is like drunkenness. You lose judgment, become confused, and may feel euphoric. Extremely narcotic divers have tried to breathe water by removing the regulator from their mouths, believing they're on the surface. Nitrogen absorption accelerates with depth. Nitrogen is 78% in regular air. Thus, breathing regular air below 130 feet increases your risk of becoming dangerously narc. Even oxygen can become toxic at depth. Pressure affects our body's processes. This can cause convulsions and blackouts. Without help, you'll drown. Common air has 21% oxygen, which is high under pressure. Thus, diving deep on regular air greatly increases oxygen toxicity risk. To clarify, you can dive to 121 feet on regular air, swim through the arch, and survive. However, you are exceeding the human body's limits. Below 200 feet in regular air, survival is nearly impossible. If you tried this, you would need to laser focus your depth gauge during your descent to avoid missing the entrance and falling into the deadly zone below. Yuri went to the Blue Hole's edge earlier in the day. His local diving instructor was TK Omar. He asked TK to guide him to the arch and film his dive. TK said he could, but with restrictions. He told Yuri he needed 2 weeks of intensive training to qualify for that dive. He also advised him to use a different gas mixture and equipment. Yuri frowned. He said he was flying to Moscow in 2 days. He had to dive now. He asked if they could do it today or tomorrow. Shaking his head, TK. No, that's not how it works. TK knew the risks better than most. At the Blue Hole, TK worked a grimmer job besides teaching diving. He was sent to the bottom to retrieve the bodies of inexperienced or arrogant divers who tried the arch and never returned. No official count, but the local diving community estimates that 200 people have died in the Blue Hole in the last decade, earning it the nickname Divers Cemetery. Yuri persisted after TK rejected her. He thanked him and asked several local diving instructors. Next day or two, can you take me to the arch? Each one gave him the same answer. No, not without proper training and gear. After being rejected by everyone, Yuri gave up and left. Later that day, the owners of the small cafes on the Blue Hole Cliffs saw a young man walk alone to the water. He carefully donned his scuba gear. He secured a large video camera to a helmet. After preparing, he looked around, walked to the edge, and jumped into the blue hole. Submerged, he vanished. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's Moscow family panicked. He missed his flight. They couldn't reach him. They reported him missing. After contacting Egyptian authorities, TK Omar was contacted. They needed him to check the blue hole for Yuri. TK prepared and dove into the dark water. He reached the bottom. He found Yuri face down on the sandy floor. They discovered something shocking when they brought Yuri's body up. His helmet camera ran continuously. He recorded his last moments. Check out Yuri's chilling final video online. This describes what it shows. He jumped in after positioning the camera on his head and pressing record. It was later confirmed that his tanks contained regular air. The camera goes underwater and shows Yuri sinking quickly into the dark blue abyss. His breathing initially sounds calm and regular. He appears calm, the descent appears controlled but rapid. But then you hear hissing. Yuri is using his buoyancy compensator. Divers can sink, float, or stay neutral with this inflatable vest. The air was leaking out as he tried to inflate it to slow down. BC was failing. His descent was unstoppable. Yuri now wore a diving weight belt. Every certified diver knows weight belts have quick-release buckles. If you need to surface quickly in an emergency, drop your weights. One of your first lessons. Yuri was panicking. He never got his weight belt because he was so focused on fixing his BC, so he kept sinking. At 181 feet, he sped past the arch entrance. He was over 200 feet. He continued to the bottom, hitting the seafloor at 392 feet. The blue hole's bottom slopes. It slopes down to a sea opening where the wall drops thousands of feet. The camera shows him sliding down this slope. He rolls over and claws at the sand and mud to avoid falling out of the blue hole into the void. He anchors in the dirt finally. Everything stops for a moment. From the footage, he appears to be looking around but is clearly confused and disoriented. His body limps. Due to extreme nitrogen narcosis or oxygen toxicity, he may have pulled his regulator out of his mouth and drowned or blacked out and dropped it. Whatever, his tragic solo journey ended. 27-year-old Aaron Ralston visited Utah on April 25, 2003. The avid outdoorsman planned to spend the weekend exploring Canyonlands National Park's remote beauty. He slept in his truck that night and woke up around 9:15 the next morning, a clear Saturday. He rode his mountain bike 15 miles to Blue John Canyon's head. The 11-mile slot canyon was stunning, with narrow spots where you could touch both walls. It was the adventure Aaron craved. His bike was locked up and he hiked down the canyon alone at 2:45 p.m. Aaron was deep in the gorge 6 hours later. He reached a narrow section about 3 feet wide with a 100-foot drop to the desert floor. He intended to chimney through, placing his feet on one wall and his back against the other and shuffling. A massive 800-pound boulder fell from the canyon wall above him as he descended into this narrow passage. It collapsed. Aaron dropped down immediately to avoid the situation. Although he avoided crushing, the boulder hit his right forearm and pinned it against the canyon wall. He was bogged. 100 feet up, 20 miles from the nearest paved road. Immediately, adrenaline surged. He tried to pull his hand free. He tried to push the huge rock. It wouldn't move. 0 millimeters. His terrifying situation dawned on him then. He hadn't revealed his plans. Not a soul knew he was in Blue John Canyon today. He was so far in the wilderness that no one would hear him scream. He had no radio or phone. Nothing connected him to the outside world. Now his situation wasn't so bad. Not only was his crushed arm hanging. Despite his discomfort, he was able to sit against the rock walls. His prison boulder was a shelf he could lean on. He calmed down after the initial panic. He checked his backpack for supplies. What he found was bad. One 12-ounce bottle of water was all he had. 2 burritos and candy bar wrapper crumbs were his meal. His only option was a cheap, generic multi-tool. The folding knife blade was small and dull. Right away, he took that little knife and started chipping away at the boulder, hoping to break off a piece and free his arm. But after a few minutes, he realized it was pointless. Rock was granite. A knife barely scratched the surface. Not going to work. As the sun set and the canyon grew cold, Aaron considered a more drastic solution. He seriously considered severing his arm, but he looked at his multi-tool's pitiful blade and thought about his forearm bones. That dull knife couldn't cut bone. The task was impossible. He put the tool away. Defeated, he meticulously rationed his meager food and water, hoping for a miracle. Perhaps another hiker would pass through this remote canyon in the next few days. Maybe he could yell and be heard. Though slim, it was his only hope. His water shortage lasted over 24 hours by the 5th day. Dehydrated and delirious, he drank his own urine to survive. He was fading fast. That night, he thought he was dying. Using his left hand, he carefully carved his name into the sandstone wall with his multi-tool. Under it, he wrote his expected death date the next day. He then took out his small digital camera, which was still partially charged. He turned it on and recorded goodbye messages for his family in a weak, cracking voice. He declared his love. He advised them not to cry. After finishing, he put the camera away, leaned against the rock, closed his eyes, and expected to die. A vivid vision came to him as he drifted in and out of consciousness. He imagined himself playing with a boy. He appeared in the vision without his right arm. He saw this as a premonition, not a hallucination. A sign. He was supposed to live. He was supposed to leave this canyon and start a family. He awoke from this vision with an overwhelming energy and one goal: survive. He looked down at his right arm, which was turning black and decomposing. He wondered, I know I can't cut through the bone, but what if I can break it? He experimented. He used the boulder's edge as a fulcrum. He tested his torque by placing his trapped arm over the edge and applying pressure. He felt a horrific bone give. He knew it was possible. He took a deep, shuddering breath and threw himself into it. He heard a terrifying snap as his ulna and radius bones broke through. The pain blinded him, but he was determined to live. He took his multi-tool. He meticulously sawed and cut his arm's skin, muscle, and nerves to repair the bones for an hour. His freedom finally came. He said he smiled when he saw his severed arm under the rock. He felt victorious. High on adrenaline, he started the difficult escape. He rappelled 65 feet to the canyon floor with one good arm. He ran on the trail. He met a Dutch hiking family after 6 miles of bleeding and shock in the desert. His appearance shocked them, but they gave him water and food and called for help. Medical personnel arrived in time from a helicopter to save Aaron. After his rescue, 13 park rangers returned to Blue John Canyon to retrieve his arm. They struggled to move the 800-pound boulder with a hydraulic jack, winch, and their strength. They later told Aaron that even if they had found him in time, they could not have set up their equipment to move the rock without it shifting and crushing him. They told him he could only survive by severing his arm. A powerful confirmation that Aaron had made the right, impossible choice. A ranger cremated his arm and gave him the ashes. A few months later, Aaron returned to the canyon. He returned to where he had been trapped for 5 days and scattered his arm ashes over the boulder that nearly killed him. The major motion picture 127 Hours was based on Aaron's incredible survival story. Aaron called the film a documentary because it's so accurate to his experience. In Port Richey, Florida, 37-year-old Marissa Weber returned home on October 28, 2006. Her mom was greeted as she entered the front door. Though she didn't hear a response, she could hear her mother cooking dinner. Marissa crossed the living room to greet. The family's small house was crowded with belongings. One of their many cats ran through the living room after Marissa took 2 steps in. As it ran past, up to the wall, and stopped, she almost tripped. It stood frozen, staring at the baseboard as if seeing something. Immediate irritation gripped Marissa. She knew what the cat was doing. She had been hearing noises for weeks, scurrying and scratching from walls and ceiling. The house had rats. Now this cat was clearly focused on one. The whole situation stressed Marissa. At 37, she hated living with her parents. The rat infestation disgustingly reminded her of her situation. Trapped, she felt. She started taking anti-anxiety and antidepressants because her anxiety was so bad. She knew her problems would be manageable if she could afford her own place, but that wasn't an option right now. She was stuck. To avoid the cat and rat, Marissa entered the kitchen from the cluttered living room. She hugged her mother briefly. Her father also said hello. Marissa refused her mother's dinner. She said she wasn't hungry but tired and would go to bed early. After hugging her mom again and saying goodnight to her dad, she climbed the stairs to her bedroom. She entered and shut the door. Marissa's parents woke up the next morning. They made breakfast and prepared for work. They hadn't heard Marissa come downstairs, and her bedroom door was still closed. They assumed she woke up early and left for her waste disposal company secretary job. They finished breakfast and went to work. Marissa was gone when they got home from work that night. Her bedroom door was closed and her car wasn't in the driveway. They weren't worried yet. They assumed she left for work early, returned home early, and went straight to her room. She was an adult. She was entitled to privacy. They hadn't heard anything from her room all night. No TV, music, or movement. Her mother's worry increased. Walking upstairs, she knocked on Marissa's door. No response. Again, she knocked louder. Still nothing. Finally, her mom turned the knob and opened the door slowly. The room was empty. Techrents became worried. She was absent yesterday evening, this morning, and tonight. Again, their daughter was 37. She could leave for a night or two without telling them. They decided to wait, expecting her in the morning. Marissa was absent the next morning. She wasn't home. They were panicking now. In particular, her mother feared the worst. Marissa, 5'3" and 100 pounds, was petite. Mom worried someone could have overpowered her and kidnapped her on her way to or from work. Marissa's mother panicked and called Gina. She told Gina that her sister was missing and possibly kidnapped and that she needed to come over immediately. Gina ran to the house. She tried to calm her frantic parents when she arrived. She reminded them that Marissa was an adult and likely had a simple explanation. She suggested they thoroughly search the house for a note or clue to where she went. The family searched the house, starting in Marissa's room, but found nothing. Then they found Marissa's purse in her room. Her wallet was inside when they opened it, a huge red flag. Why would Marissa travel extensively without her wallet? It was absurd. They reported her missing to the police. Police investigations stalled. Nothing indicated foul play, no leads or witnesses. Marissa disappeared 12 days after saying goodnight to her parents, leaving the family devastated by November 9. Gina began to consider a darker possibility. She knew her sister was terribly sad. The rat problem stressed her out because it symbolized her life's stagnation. Gina considered the possibility that Marissa had fled. She could have hurt herself. Gina went through the house one last time that day to find any hint of Marissa's mental state before she disappeared. Marissa's bedroom was her starting point. She entered her sister's room from the hall upstairs. The place was cluttered, similar to a hoarder's room. Stacks of clothes were taller than people. Every surface was cluttered. Gina was determined. She meticulously searched piles of junk, underclothes, and everywhere else. She found nothing. However, she noticed her sister's large bookshelf as she scanned the room. She saw something odd in the middle of the shelf. Although the lights were on, she used a flashlight to look better. She turned it on and pointed the beam at the strange object. Her blood-curdling scream came when the light hit it. Gina discovered Marissa Weber's true fate. After saying goodnight to her parents, Marissa sat on her bed in her room. She took some morphine and codeine pills from a bottle by her bed. Her marijuana joint was rolled and smoked. After that, she grabbed the TV remote to relax and sleep. She pointed the remote at the TV on a bureau across the room, but nothing happened. Marissa immediately identified the issue. TV likely unplugged from wall. It happened frequently. Moving around in her packed room often caused things to hit the bureau, jiggling the plug loose. But the outlet wasn't behind the bureau. A massive, heavy bookshelf against the bureau's side hid the power cord. There were too many books and collectibles to reach behind the bookshelf, which was too heavy to move. Only by climbing on top of the bureau where the TV was and reaching into the small gap between the back of the bookshelf and the wall could the plug be reached. Marissa, likely high from her drugs, climbed onto the bureau. She leaned over and searched behind the 6-foot bookshelf for the plug, just out of her reach. She leaned farther and farther until she grabbed the plug. While pushing it back into the wall socket, she lost her balance and fell. Head first, she fell into the tiny dark space behind the bookshelf, getting stuck between it and the wall. Why she didn't call for help is unknown. Maybe the drugs made her too confused to realize the danger. Maybe she was embarrassed. Her first crucial moments were silent for some reason. Tragically, too much time upside down starts a terrible process. The upper body receives all blood. Head pressure rises. The most dangerous part is that the heavy organs and pooled blood press on the lungs, making breathing difficult. Taking a deep breath is necessary to project your voice. You can't yell for help. After a few moments, Marissa realized she was stuck and likely couldn't breathe loud enough for her parents downstairs. She was alive and trapped upside down behind that bookshelf for 1 or 2 days. She probably saw her family members entering and exiting her room, calling her name. She could not physically alert them. No sound came from her. She died of positional asphyxia. Her family later said they heard noises in her room during their search. However, they resembled the rats scratching and scurrying in the walls. No one knew it was likely Marissa, still alive, desperately moving behind the bookcase to get their attention. A strange smell developed in the room after she died. Again, they blamed the room's mess and rat problem. On November 9, Gina saw something strange behind the bookshelf in the room. She saw her sister's foot. After shining the flashlight on it and scanning down, she was horrified to find her sister's body there all along. 28-year-old Mike Barnett woke up in his Hull home on June 25, 2007. He heard heavy rain on the roof first. He rolled out of bed grumbling. He and everyone in Hull were sick of it raining like this for a month. He groaned for another reason. He knew he had to work at a tropical fish store on his day off. Behind the store was a notoriously bad draining street. When it rained hard, leaves and debris clogged the storm drain, flooding the street. Mike's fish store boss was old. Mike knew his boss would try to clean the drain himself. Mike considered it his duty to assist. He knew his boss was too old for that kind of work, especially in a storm. Mike got dressed and ate breakfast quickly. He then quietly left the front door. Not waking his live-in dad was his goal. Mike and his dad were always close, but Mike's mother's death brought them closer. They loved living together. Mike knew his father was also protective. He knew his father would never let him clear a flooded storm drain in this dangerous storm. It was risky, and Mike didn't want that argument. He left the house without his dad hearing him. The fish store was his destination by car. He jumped out and went around the building when he arrived. The entire street was a brown, swirling lake. The drain was clogged. Mike saw his boss starting his morning routine in the shop. Mike waded into the floodwater to work without saying hello. The sidewalk side culvert had a clogged drain. Mike carefully stepped off the curb into the cold, muddy water. He walked to the drain he knew. The water reached his ankles and knees. As he approached the culvert, a powerful suction pulled at his feet. It dragged him down. He tried to pull his feet back, but they felt stuck. The force pulled him toward the drain. In an instant, he was pulled down, and water reached his neck. His thigh exploded with blinding pain as he went under. Water sucked Mike's leg through a hole in the blocked drainage grate without his knowledge. The suction had pulled his leg into his upper thigh and brutally snapped his femur. Mike was up to his neck in cold, moving water, suffering from his broken leg. The wind was howling, the rain was pouring, and the water was splashing into his mouth, making breathing difficult. He panicked. He struggled to escape, but was held. He screamed for help. Mike was floundering in the water when the fish store owner looked out the back window. The panic on Mike's face told him this was a serious emergency. Calling the police was his immediate response. Then he ran outside to help Mike. The first two police officers found Mike still in the water up to his neck, with the shop owner trying to keep his head up. Officers thought the situation was simple. They would rescue the trapped man. The two officers waded into the water, flanked Mike, and grabbed his shoulders. Strong men began pulling hard. When they did, Mike screamed in such guttural anguish that the officers automatically let go. Startled, they realized it was worse than it seemed. Mike was trapped and the rain was coming down hard. The water level was rising gradually. Mike's body, partially blocking the drain, worsened the flooding. The officers knew they were rushing. If not rescued quickly, he would drown. Over several hours, a massive rescue operation occurred. More police, firefighters, and EMTs arrived. Good Samaritans came to help. They did everything they could to rescue Mike. Bolt cutters were used to cut the metal grate, but the water was too deep and muddy to see, and the current was too strong to position the cutters. They even tried to pull Mike out with a Land Rover winch around his torso, but every attempt failed. The water's force pinned him to the grate was too much, and every movement hurt. First responders made a tough decision after 4 hours in the freezing water with Mike. Amputating his leg was necessary. The emergency field amputation required a willing and capable doctor. Mike could tell things were going wrong by now. He frantically asked the police and firefighters, "When are you going to get me out?" They kept saying, "Soon, Mike. Just hold on. It's going to be okay." Meanwhile, the shop owner reached Mike's dad. Mike's father arrived at the chaos while waiting for the doctor. He pushed through the crowd screaming, "I'll get my son out," but stopped when he saw his son. The sight was awful. Mike was up to his chin in water. Behind him, a rescue diver held his head up to prevent him from submerging. Mike had deathly pale skin, unfocused eyes, and a blank, vacant expression as if he wasn't there. A wall of police officers rushed over to Mike's dad, blocking him. He was told they were trying everything. They told him to return home. Mike's dad knew he couldn't be near his son, even though he didn't want to. After losing, he went home without speaking to Mike. Mike's dad turned on the TV at home. Local news broadcast the rescue attempt live. He watched his son's life hang in the balance on his living room screen. Mike's dad watched his son die on live television a few minutes later as the camera zoomed in. When the doctor arrived with a special saw to amputate his leg, it was too late. In the freezing water for over 4 hours, Mike died of hypothermia. Many thanks for viewing. Comment your thoughts about today's episode, and remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time, see you. That one early in the morning on February 5th, 1990, 57-year-old Laverne Pavlin stood alone in the quiet of her kitchen in Wilsonville, Oregon. The apartment was still dark, and the smell of fresh coffee slowly drifted through the air. To anyone looking in from the outside, it would have seemed like an ordinary, peaceful morning, but for Laverne, these early hours were the only moments of the day when she could breathe. Just a few minutes earlier, her boyfriend, John Sosnavsky, had left for work at the nearby mill. Laverne had stood silently by the kitchen window and waited for the sound she depended on every morning, the front door shutting behind him. Then came the heavy rumble of the bus pulling away from the curb outside. Only after the noise faded did she finally relax her shoulders, because when John was gone, Laverne could move freely through her own apartment without fear. She could pour herself a cup of coffee without worrying she was doing something wrong. She could read the newspaper without glancing over her shoulder. For a little while, the apartment stopped feeling like a trap. And on this particular morning, sitting alone at her kitchen table, Laverne had no idea that before the day was over, she was going to make a phone call that would pull police into one of the most disturbing murder investigations Oregon had seen in years. A case that would eventually destroy multiple lives and reveal a truth far more horrifying than anyone first believed. In reality, John was an incredibly violent man. He was physically abusive and his temper was explosive, especially when he was drunk, which was just about all the time. His anger was a constant, simmering presence in their home, and Laverne lived her life walking on eggshells, trying not to set him off. Laverne hadn't always lived like this. She had been married before to a man she loved dearly, but her husband had passed away from cancer, leaving her completely heartbroken and alone. It was in the depths of this grief and vulnerability that she had met John. He had seemed charming at first, a lifeline in a sea of loneliness. She hadn't seen the darkness in him, not until she was already in too deep. By the time she realized the kind of person he truly was, it felt like it was too late to get out. That was 10 years ago. A whole decade had passed, and Laverne still hadn't found the courage or the means to leave him. The simple, hard truth was that she was terrified of him. She had no idea how he would react if she tried to leave, but she could imagine it, and her imagination painted a very grim picture. And so she felt completely and utterly trapped in her own home with her own life. On this particular morning, she took her fresh cup of coffee and sat down at her small kitchen table. She unfolded the local paper, hoping to lose herself in the day's news for a bit. But as soon as she opened it, the first thing that caught her eye was a large black and white photograph. It was a picture of a smiling young woman, probably in her early 20s. The picture was attached to an article about a recent murder that had happened about 30 miles away, just northeast of Portland. The victim in the article had been identified as a woman named Tanya Bennett, and Tanya Bennett was the young, smiling woman in the photo. The article went on to explain that she had been brutally beaten and then strangled to death with the belt of a robe. After she was killed, her body had been left on the side of a highway. As Laverne read the details, her eyes scanned over the location where Tanya's body was found. The article mentioned it was a remote stretch of highway, and when she read the specific area, a chill ran down her spine. The spot where Tanya was dumped was only about a mile and a half away from a famous scenic overlook, a place that Laverne herself had been to before. She knew the area. She could picture it in her mind. Laverne kept reading the article, her eyes flicking back and forth between the printed words and the photograph of Tanya, and as she did, a strange feeling started to form in her mind. It was a nagging, unsettling sense that she knew something about this. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the details felt disturbingly familiar. She stared at Tanya's smiling face for a long moment, and then it was like a switch flipped in her brain. All the scattered, unsettling pieces suddenly clicked together, and in that moment of horrifying clarity, Laverne realized that she was almost certain she knew who had killed this young woman. She was almost certain it was John. Even though she treasured her peaceful, quiet mornings with her coffee and the newspaper, this was different. This was urgent. Laverne immediately stood up from the table, her coffee forgotten. She walked over to the wall-mounted phone in her kitchen, her hands shaking slightly, and she called the police. After she hung up the phone, Laverne felt a wave of adrenaline and fear wash over her. Her heart was still pounding in her chest. What she had just done was a massive risk, a huge gamble. She had just told the police that she suspected her own boyfriend of murder, but she had no way of knowing if the information she had given them was enough. Was it enough for them to actually arrest John, or would they just question him and let him go? If they let him go, it was entirely possible, even probable, that John would find out what she had done. He would discover that she had betrayed him, that she had called the police and implicated him in a murder. And if that happened, Laverne was sure that his abuse would not only continue, it would get so much worse. The way she saw it, her life was now heading down one of two paths. Either the chapter of her life with John was finally over and he was going to prison for murder, or she, Laverne Pavlin, might very well end up being the next dead girl on the side of the highway. A little over a week went by. Then, on the morning of February 16th, a man named Detective John Ingram sat on a couch in a very clean and tidy living room in Wilsonville, Oregon. He was there with his partner, and they were in Laverne Pavlin's apartment. Ingram was the lead investigator assigned to the Tanya Bennett murder case, and he was there to speak with the woman who had made that phone call. Laverne was sitting on the couch opposite them, and she was a bundle of nerves. She kept fidgeting with her hands, her eyes darting around the room. She repeatedly offered Ingram and his partner coffee, water, anything they wanted. It was crystal clear to Ingram that this woman had a tremendous amount on her mind and that she was deeply frightened. Ingram already knew the basics. He knew that a week earlier, Laverne had called in a tip suggesting that her boyfriend, John Sosnavsky, might be Tanya Bennett's killer. Now, Ingram was here to hear the full story. He was eager to listen to whatever she had to say, to get all the details about why she believed her boyfriend was a murderer. He was especially eager because, to be frank, his investigation was going nowhere. This tip from Laverne was the only real lead he had. Tanya's body had been found on a grassy slope so close to the edge of the highway that passing cars could have easily seen her. And yet, Ingram and his team had not been able to find a single witness who saw anything. A few people had come forward saying they thought they had seen Tanya at a bar earlier on the night she disappeared, and they said she was with a man, but nobody could give a useful description of this man. He was just some guy. And so, Ingram and his partner had spent the last couple of weeks talking to absolutely everyone they could think of. They interviewed Tanya's family, her friends, her co-workers. They canvassed her entire neighborhood, knocking on every door. And still, nothing. They had no suspects, no persons of interest, nothing at all. To make matters worse, the crime scene itself had yielded very little. There was no good physical evidence, no fingerprints, no useful forensics that could point them in the right direction. So now, sitting in this quiet, clean living room, Ingram was pinning all his hopes on Laverne. He was hoping she was the key that would unlock this entire case. Eventually, after letting her settle for a moment, Ingram looked at Laverne and spoke in a calm, steady voice. He told her, "Whenever you're ready, just tell me what you know. Tell me the whole story of why you think John killed Tanya." At first, Laverne just continued to squirm in her seat. Her nervousness was palpable. But Ingram reassured her, telling her to just take a deep breath to calm down. He told her it was okay, they were just there to listen. And finally, with a voice that trembled, she began to speak. She told them that on the night of the murder, John had come home very late, sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning, and the very first thing he did when he got home was go straight into the bathroom and get in the shower. Now, this was highly unusual for him. John was not the type of person to take a shower at 2 o'clock in the morning. It was just not part of his routine. Laverne said she hadn't thought too much about it at the time. But the very next day, something else happened that made the late-night shower seem much more sinister. She and John had gone to a local bar, and while they were there, she had overheard him. He was talking to someone, bragging, and he was bragging about murdering Tanya Bennett. She heard him describe in detail how he had picked Tanya up at a truck stop, how he had killed her, and then how he had driven her body out to the highway by the Columbia River Gorge to dump it near that scenic overlook. As Laverne relayed this story, Ingram and his partner were listening intently. They were shocked. Essentially, Laverne had overheard a full confession, and the details she was providing seemed to line up perfectly with what they already knew. Tanya had been seen late at night with an unknown man, and her body was indeed found near that scenic overlook. That part was public knowledge, but still, the fact that Laverne had heard John say it specifically was a powerful piece of the puzzle. Ingram kept a straight face, a poker face, and just calmly told Laverne to please keep going, to tell them everything. And so, Laverne continued her story. She explained that the reason she didn't come forward immediately was simple. She was scared of John. She described him as a violent alcoholic who regularly abused her. This history of abuse was also part of why his confession seemed so real to her. The idea that John was capable of killing someone wasn't a shock to her at all. She lived in fear of his violence every day. She was terrified that if she went to the police, he would find out and he might kill her too. And so, she had kept this terrible secret to herself for days. But then she saw the article in the newspaper. She saw the picture of Tanya's face, and she said the girl just looked so young and so innocent. And in that moment, she felt like she owed it to that girl. She had to come forward, no matter the risk to herself. By this point, Ingram's mind was racing. If everything Laverne was saying was true, this was huge. This could potentially solve the entire case right here and now. This was the story of what happened to Tanya Bennett. But he was also an experienced detective, and he knew that right now, all he had was one woman's story. It was a compelling story, but he needed more than that. He needed actual, physical proof. He couldn't just take her word for it. So he asked Laverne a question. He asked if she would be willing to let him and his partner search the apartment. Laverne just nodded, and as soon as she gave her consent, the two detectives were on their feet, ready to get to work. Laverne led them down a short hallway to the master bedroom. Once there, she stepped back into the hallway, giving them space to do their search. The detectives immediately split up, spreading out to cover the room more efficiently. Ingram had a mental list of things he was hoping to find. But there was one very specific item on that list. When Tanya's body was discovered, a small swatch of denim from the front buttonfly area of her jeans was missing. It looked like it had been intentionally and carefully cut out. This was a very unusual detail, and it made Ingram think that maybe the killer had taken a souvenir, a trophy. After a few minutes of searching the bedroom, however, Ingram hadn't found that denim patch. In fact, at first glance, he didn't see anything at all that seemed to connect John to Tanya. He was starting to feel a bit discouraged until he moved over to a corner of the room where there was a cardboard box filled with old papers. He began to sift through the contents of the box, looking at random receipts and documents, and that's when he found it. He pulled out a small, torn piece of scrap paper. On it, there was a handwritten message. It was short, just 4 words. It said, quote, "T. Bennett, good peace." As soon as he read it, Ingram froze. He immediately called his partner over. His partner walked across the room, looked down at the note, and then looked back at Ingram. And they both knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they needed to bring John Sosnowski in for a chat right away. The detectives wrapped up their search and prepared to leave the apartment. But as they were walking towards the front door, the door suddenly opened. And standing there in the doorway, having just come home, was none other than John Sosnowski himself. About an hour later, Detective Ingram was sitting at an interrogation table inside the sheriff's office. He was staring across the metal table at John. John had a confused look on his face, but other than that, he seemed remarkably calm, almost unbothered. Back at the apartment, when John had walked in and seen 2 detectives standing in his living room, Ingram had explained who he was and why they were there. John had seemed surprised, but he hadn't argued or resisted. He had quickly agreed to come down to the station to answer some questions. Ingram knew from years of experience, though, that just because a suspect was acting cooperative didn't mean he was innocent. Sometimes it meant the exact opposite. Ingram took a photograph of Tanya Bennett and slid it across the table towards John. He asked him if he knew the woman in the picture, or if he had anything to do with her murder. John didn't deny it. He didn't act horrified or offended at the suggestion. He just looked at the picture and said he didn't really remember. Then, Ingram showed him the note they had found in his bedroom, the one that said, "T. Bennett, good peace." John just squinted at it as if he was having trouble reading it, and then said he really wasn't sure if he had written that or not. These were very straightforward yes or no questions, and the fact that John apparently couldn't give a straight answer to any of them was highly suspicious to Ingram. The rest of the interview went pretty much the same way. No matter what Ingram asked, even the most basic questions, John would respond with vague, non-committal answers. He couldn't remember. He wasn't sure. Maybe. Ingram was struck by how incredibly nonchalant John seemed throughout the entire process. He was being questioned about his potential connection to a brutal murder, and he was acting like they were discussing the weather. This was not a time to be nonchalant. This was a time to be clear, to be forthcoming, to proclaim your innocence. But despite Ingram's strong suspicions about John, he knew that realistically, he didn't have enough to hold him. The only evidence he had at this point was all circumstantial. He had Lavernay's story, and he had a strange cryptic note that they couldn't even definitively prove John had written. It wasn't nearly enough to actually arrest him for murder. What they needed was some kind of hard, physical evidence that directly connected John to Tanya. Without that, their case was just too weak. So, at the end of the frustrating interview, Ingram just sighed and told John that for now he was free to go. 4 days passed. Ingram was at his desk at the office, just starting his morning, when his phone rang. He picked it up and was surprised to hear Lavernay's voice on the other end of the line. Before he could even ask her why she was calling, Lavernay told him that she had found something. She had found something in her car that morning, and she felt like he needed to see it right away. And when she told him what it was, Ingram told her not to move, that he would be right over. He immediately hung up the phone and ran to find his partner. As he drove over to Laverna's apartment, Ingram could feel his heart racing with anticipation. Over the past 4 days, the investigation had stalled again. They hadn't found any additional evidence to prove that John was their killer. In fact, they had actually lost a piece of evidence. The note they had found in John's box of papers turned out to be a dead end. Their handwriting analysts couldn't definitively match the writing on the note to John's handwriting, so they couldn't even be sure he was the one who wrote it. But now, based on what Lavernay had just told him on the phone, what she had found in her car, Ingram was almost positive that this was the big break he had been waiting for. This was going to be the piece of evidence that tied everything together. Within the hour, Ingram and his partner were standing in Laverne's garage. Laverne was there with them, and all 3 of them were staring into the open trunk of her car. Laverne explained to Ingram that she was a very neat person. She kept her car, her apartment, her whole life very, very clean. And earlier that day, when she had gone to put something in her trunk, she noticed a small swatch of denim fabric just sitting there. She knew for a fact that she hadn't put it there. And given that she was on high alert about John and his possible connection to the murder, it immediately seemed like something she needed to report to the police. For Ingram and his partner, as they stared into the trunk at this little piece of denim, it felt like a bombshell. It looked exactly like the swatch of denim they had been secretly looking for. The police had never publicly revealed that a piece of Tanya's jeans had been cut out and taken by her killer. That detail was kept private, known only to the investigators. And now, here was what looked like that exact piece of denim in the trunk of a car owned by their prime suspect's girlfriend. It felt too perfect to be a coincidence. This had to be the break they needed. Clearly, this was the denim from Tanya's jeans. Laverne had been right to call them. This was huge. Of course, Ingram knew that they would still have to send the denim to the lab for testing, just to be 100% sure that it really belonged to Tanya. It was technically possible that it belonged to Laverne, or to John, or was completely unrelated, but circumstantially, this felt like hitting the jackpot. Ingram watched as his partner carefully picked up the swatch of denim with a pair of tweezers, placed it into an evidence bag, and sealed it. They told Laverne they would have it tested immediately and that they would be in touch. The following morning, Ingram was back at his desk reviewing all the evidence they had collected so far, and at this point, it was starting to feel like a lot. The previous night after finding the denim, they had brought John in for another round of questioning. This time, they had him take a polygraph test, and he had failed it completely. The test administrator who conducted the polygraph even wrote in his official report that, in his professional opinion, John definitely knew what had happened to Tanya Bennett. So now Ingram was just sitting at his desk, waiting. He was waiting for one last piece of confirmation. He was waiting for the phone to ring with the lab results confirming that the fabric was a match. As soon as he got that call, he could get an arrest warrant and go pick up John. And just then, his phone rang. He picked it up immediately. It was the lab. Ingram sat up straight in his chair, ready to hear the good news. But the voice of the lab technician on the other end of the line sounded glum, disappointed. The tech told Ingram that the denim from Laverne's car did not match the jeans that Tanya had been wearing. It wasn't hers. Ingram was completely stunned. He just sat there, holding the phone, unable to process what he was hearing. The idea that they had just found the exact same unique cut of denim from the exact same spot on a pair of jeans in a car connected to their main suspect, just by sheer coincidence, was impossible. It just couldn't be a coincidence. People don't just have little swatches of denim from the front of their jeans lying around in their car trunks. It was too specific. There had to be more to the story. Ingram tried to work through some kind of reasonable explanation in his head. But no matter how he looked at it, the only thing that made any sense was that the denim swatch was a fake, that it had been planted there. And as that realization sunk in, he felt a mix of shock and intense frustration. He thought he was so close to solving this case, and now he felt like he was right back at square one. Ingram hung up the phone. He knew what his next stop had to be. He needed to go talk to Laverne again. Later that same morning, Ingram and his partner were once again back in Laverne's spotless living room. A very nervous-looking Laverne was sitting on the couch across from them. But this time, Ingram's approach was going to be different. He was going to be a little tougher with her because he now knew for certain that whatever story she had told them before was not the full truth. As soon as they were all settled, Ingram looked Laverne right in the eye and asked her, point blank, if she had planted that piece of denim inside her car. As soon as the words left his mouth, Laverne's face began to quiver. Her eyes filled with tears, and then she just broke down, sobbing. Through her sobs, she told them that she was so sorry. She confessed that she had done it. She had cut up an old pair of jeans and put that front button part in her trunk, and then pretended to have found it. She said she did it so that they would have enough evidence to finally arrest John. She explained that she had gotten so worried when they had let him go after the first interview. She was convinced that John had killed Tanya. She had heard him talk about it. She knew he did it, and she knew he was a dangerous man. She just wanted to make sure that the police held him accountable for what he had done. As Ingram listened to her, he could hear the earnestness in her voice. It was clear that this woman was genuinely terrified of John, and that she truly believed he was a killer. And so, he wanted to believe her motivation for planting the evidence, as misguided and illegal as it was. But there was a critical problem with her story. He knew that Laverne was still not telling him everything, because there was simply no way she could have known to plant that specific, unique cut of the jeans. She couldn't have known that was the piece the killer had taken as a trophy unless she had intimate knowledge of the crime or some other kind of inside information. Something was still missing. Why? Out of all the possible pieces of evidence she could have faked, would she randomly choose that exact piece of denim? It was way too specific to be a lucky guess. And when Ingram pointed this out to her when he asked her how she knew about the denim, Laverne's entire energy shifted. The sobbing stopped. The sadness and remorse vanished, and it was replaced with pure hesitation. She looked like she didn't know how to react. It was the look of someone who had just been caught in a much bigger lie. Laverne took a deep breath, and she looked at Ingram. And then she said, "I was lying. You're right. My story about planting the evidence, that was a lie too." But she went on to say that the reason she had lied about it was because she had been too afraid. She was afraid that if the police knew the whole, real story, that she would get in trouble too. And then, Laverne explained what she claimed really happened to Tanya Bennett. On the night that Tanya was murdered, Laverne said that John had called her. He was frantic on the phone. He told her that he was in trouble, big trouble, and that she needed to meet him at the bar where he was at. And he told her to bring a shower curtain with her. Laverne said that because she was so scared of John, she didn't ask any questions, she just did exactly what he said. She took a shower curtain from their bathroom, got in her car, and drove to the bar. When she got there, she found John in the parking lot, and he was standing over a body. It was Tanya, and she was lying motionless on the cold asphalt. Laverne said she was horrified. She didn't know what to do, so she just did what John told her to do. She helped him. She helped him lift Tanya's body and put it into the trunk of her car, Laverne's car. They wrapped Tanya up in the shower curtain she had brought, and then together they drove out to that spot along the highway and dumped her body. But as Laverne continued to talk, her story suddenly got much darker. Because she then confessed that Tanya had not actually been dead when she first arrived in that parking lot. She said Tanya was still clinging to life. And then, at John's request, Laverne had tied a rope around Tanya's neck and held it tight while John sexually assaulted her. Laverne said that after he was done, Tanya was no longer breathing. Ingram could barely conceal his shock as he listened to this. Here was this gentle, soft-spoken, nervous little lady, and she was now telling him that she had actively participated in the sexual assault and murder of a young woman. It was almost impossible to wrap his head around. All Ingram could think was, this can't be real. But what Laverne was saying just fit. It explained everything. It explained John's cagey answers during his interrogation. It explained his failed polygraph test. And it explained how Laverne knew the exact right part of the genes to cut out and use as fake evidence. She knew because she and John were the ones who had actually made that cut on Tanya's genes in the first place. But despite getting this earth-shattering confession, Ingram wanted to be absolutely 100% sure that this version of the story Laverne was telling him was finally the truth. And he knew exactly how to prove it. The following day, Ingram was behind the wheel of his police cruiser. His partner was in the passenger seat and Laverne was sitting in the back, staring absently out the window. They were driving down the highway northeast of Portland. Ingram had instructed Laverne to simply let him know when they reached the spot where she and John had dumped Tanya's body. The newspapers had published the general location where the body was found, but not the specific exact spot. So Ingram knew that if Laverne could point out that exact spot, it would mean she was telling the truth. As they got closer and closer to the area where Ingram knew the body had been found, he could feel his own heart rate start to pick up. But he didn't change his speed. He didn't give any indication that they were approaching the crime scene. He just kept driving at a steady pace, going straight, waiting for Laverne to say something. But the cruiser drove right past the actual spot where Tanya's body had been found, and Laverne didn't say a word for a few more minutes. They just kept driving down the road in total silence. Ingram was feeling deeply disappointed. He was starting to think this was another dead end. But then, suddenly, Laverne spoke up from the back seat. "Hey, wait a minute," she said. "Turn around." So Ingram found a place to turn the car around, and soon they were heading back in the direction they had just come from. And this time, as they passed the actual crime scene, the exact spot where Tanya had been found, Laverne called out. "That's it," she said. "That's where she was. Stop." Ingram pulled the car over onto the shoulder of the road. He looked back at Laverne, who was staring intently out the window, right at the exact spot on the grassy slope where Tanya's body had been discovered. After he parked, all three of them got out of the car. Laverne walked over to the edge of the road and pointed. She pointed directly to the precise spot on the slope where Tanya had been found. Even though Ingram tried to keep his expression neutral, internally he was amazed. Clearly, Laverne was telling the truth this time. It would have been impossible for her to have chosen that specific spot without having been there before. She had to have been involved. As they all climbed back into the cruiser, Ingram knew they now had more than enough. They could formally arrest John, and also Laverne. She had done the right thing by finally coming forward with the truth, but now she would have to face the consequences for her actions. On February 21st, just 16 days after Laverne had made that first anonymous phone call, John Sosnavsky was arrested. 5 days after that, Laverne Pavlin was arrested as well, and both of them were charged with murder. About 11 months later, Laverne's trial began. At her trial, Laverne tried to change her story yet again. She tried to recant her confession, claiming that she hadn't actually done any of the things she had told the police. But the jury didn't buy her last-minute change of heart. They convicted her of murder, and she was sentenced to life in prison. 2 months after Laverne was sentenced, John had his trial. He was also found guilty, and he was given the same sentence, life in prison. And from a legal perspective, that should have been the end of the case. But for the next 3 years, Detective Ingram just couldn't stop thinking about it. He couldn't stop thinking about Laverne and John and Tanya Bennett. Despite what Laverne had confessed to doing, he still felt a strange sort of empathy for her. It was obvious that she had been under John's control for years, and she had seemed genuinely terrified of him. But it was more than that. Ingram just had this horrible, nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach that they had gotten something wrong. Then, one afternoon in March of 1994, Ingram was in his office at the sheriff's department going through some paperwork. His desk phone rang. When he picked it up, it was the prosecutor who had worked on Tanya's case. The prosecutor told him that they had just received a very strange letter about Tanya Bennett's murder. And as soon as the prosecutor described what the letter said, Ingram felt sick to his stomach. Ingram had been right to worry. He and his partner and the entire legal system had gotten this case completely wrong. It turned out that their star witness, Laverna Pavlin, was not who she appeared to be. She was not just a sweet, older lady who was afraid of her abusive boyfriend. She was not someone who had bravely come forward to tell the truth, despite the consequences to herself. That was not the real story. In fact, almost everything she had told Detective Ingram and his partner had been a lie. The only part that was true, and the part that ultimately drove her to do what she did, was that she desperately wanted to break up with John. But she was too scared to just leave him. So she came up with a different plan. She decided to frame him for murder, and at first she did an incredible job of it. She read every newspaper article she could find, memorizing all the little public details about the murder. During that first interview in her apartment, she had managed to sneak a peek at Detective Ingram's notepad, which had a list of evidence they were looking for. And that's how she knew about the specific swatch of denim that was missing from Tanya's jeans. She also just happened to make a few incredibly lucky guesses. When she pointed out the spot on the side of the highway where the body was found, she was just guessing. But she happened to guess the exact right spot, which convinced the police her entire story was true. The problem was, her plan backfired spectacularly. She succeeded in framing John, getting him arrested and convicted of a murder he didn't commit. But in the process of building her elaborate story, she had also inadvertently implicated herself. When she confessed to her role in the murder, her thinking was that the police would take pity on her, that they would see her as another one of John's victims and blame him for everything. She thought he would go to jail and she would be set free. But that's not what happened. She was also convicted of murder, and she went to prison right alongside him. Laverne and John were both in prison serving their life sentences when the actual killer, the real man who had murdered Tanya Bennett, sent a letter to the authorities. In the letter, he confessed to his crime in detail. That was why the prosecutor had called Ingram. It was to tell him that they had made a terrible mistake. After the real killer was arrested and his confession was verified in 1995, Laverne Pavlin and John Susnavsky were both released from prison. In total, they had each served 4 years behind bars for a crime neither of them had committed, all because of Laverne's desperate and twisted lies. Thanks for watching. If this case shocked you, there are plenty more twisted true crime stories waiting for you right now. And remember, sometimes the most dangerous person in a case isn't the one screaming for help. It's the one who sounds the most believable.